Look for details. That's part of the fun of being a photographer, I think. You start to spot little things that other people didn't even notice. And then when you get a photo of it, it's amazing. People just go, how did you even see that, let alone get a picture? It's very easy to get interesting photos if you start to look for the little details. You could just be walking through your garden or a jungle or something and find the way that beautiful little leaves have little curls on the end of them, or raindrops on the back of a leaf, or the way the spores grow on the back of a fern leaf. Feather details. We were out photographing Uluru a couple of years ago, and the sun went down and we got some nice photos, and then we were just sort of thinking, what are we going to do now? And Jess actually spotted the reflection of Uluru in my eye, but she's got far more beautiful eyes than I do. So we swapped positions and I got a macro lens out and I took a photo of Uluru reflected in her eye. And people love this kind of photo. Technically it's a terrible photo. It's just about all blurry. But just because it's one of those little details that people go, wow, how did you even see that? That's a great shot. So keep your eye out for little details and textures and things like that. They can be good photos. Okay, you've got to remember to take some vertical photos as well. A lot of us just only ever take horizontal photos, and that's a bit sad because some subjects just fit a vertical frame a whole lot better. Even long sweeping landscape shots like this one, you can still have a vertical version of that and it still works. Actually, when I went on my first Australian Geographic assignment, I was reading the contract points, and one of them actually said, every single thing you photograph, you must take a horizontal and a vertical version of every single thing. And that blew me away. Often one of them might look better than the other, fair enough, but you can always take both and they always work. This one, the feeling is more, wow, what an amazing open view she has out that way. Wow, wouldn't that be incredible? And the other photo is a bit more like, oh, don't stand so close to the edge. Your eye travels down the mountain instead, it feels taller. Now, if it feels awkward for you to take vertical photos, then that's a good sign that you're not taking enough of them. Maybe pretend you're on assignment for a while, and next time you're taking a picture, force yourself to work out how to make it fit nice composition vertically. Take some of that as well. It'll just be good practice for you. And the last one, break these rules sometimes. Photography is a creative outlet. It's not like engineering where you've got your top 10 checklist and you better double check you've got every single one done. Otherwise the bridge is going to fall down, you're going to kill someone. But firstly, what actually is exposure? Well, exposure is light falling onto your image sensor. And you can think of it as the entire time the shutter is open, more and more light is landing on there and it's just collecting more and it's getting brighter and brighter. And hopefully when the right amount of light has gone in there, your photo finishes and you end up with perfect exposure. Obviously half the time that's not what happens and you end up with incorrect exposure. So underexposed, just not enough light got in there yet and everything's come out looking too dark. Overexposed, too much light got in there and everything just comes out looking too bright. Correct exposure, just the right amount of light. But the problem can be that by the time you get, this part of the photo looking correctly exposed, some other part will still be too dark or too bright. And that's caused by what's called a contrast limitation. All cameras have this problem where they can't see into the bright and into the dark at the same time. So you've got a situation like this one perhaps, where we've got the foreground having correct exposure, but by then those background rocks in the brighter sun, they're now massively overexposed. And you go, well, that doesn't look any good. Maybe we'll set the camera up to get correct exposure for the background. But now, of course, the foreground is too dark, and there's nothing you can do in the one picture to fix that up. You could deliberately take both and merge them together using HDR, high dynamic range, or something like that. There's just nothing you can do to get around that problem of really harsh lighting having such a big difference between being in the bright and in the shadow. But the thing is, when I was standing there looking at that view myself, it looked great. And then you get a picture like that back and you're left wondering, what is wrong with the camera? It's not particularly that the human eye has some incredible ability to see into the dark and the bright at the same time. It does have a better contrast range than a camera, but still the main thing to remember is that the camera has that variable sized aperture hole in the lens, and your eye has exactly the same thing in your iris or your pupil. The thing is, when you're looking at a scene, the pupil changes depending on where you're looking so that everything looks correct for you. So when you look up here in the bright part of the scene, your pupil would shut right down and cut out all that light, so that would be correctly exposed. But then when you look down in the shadows, your pupil would open up and let more light in, and then the shadows would look correctly exposed. But the thing is, you remember when you looked up to the top, that's what it looked like, and when you look down in the shadows, that's what it looked like. You're kind of just building up a mental picture of the world that seems wonderfully exposed wherever you look, but it's because it's changing a lot. Of course, with a camera though, you're stuck with the one setting for the entire shot, and there are just going to be some bits that are so much brighter that they become overexposed or underexposed, and there's just not a lot you can do. You've just got to remember that cameras can't cope well with scenes that differ too much in their brightness. So really strong lighting, like midday lighting, that's why it's such a bad time to take photos, because the difference of the side that's in the sun and the side that's in the shade just next to it, it's a million times different, and the camera just can't cope. You're going to end up with black shadows or overexposed highlights. So collecting the right amount of light, you can think of it as a volume of light you've got to get into your camera somehow, and it really doesn't matter whether it all comes in at once or if you just gradually let the light trickle in, as long as at the end of the shot you've collected that same total volume, because that total amount of light is what determines how bright your photo is. That brings us to this useful little analogy. This is the size of your aperture hole here. If you make that a really small hole, obviously the light can only gradually trickle in, and it takes the camera quite a long time to collect the amount of light it needs for that correctly exposed photo. So you typically have quite long, slow shutter speeds associated with those tiny little holes. Conversely, if you open the aperture up to a really big hole, like that, the light's able to rush in very quickly, and you typically have quite fast shutter speeds associated with the large aperture holes. That makes sense to that level, but the key thing to realize here is that both of those photos are correctly exposed. They both look exactly the same in terms of brightness, but they're creatively different due to the effects of having different shutter speeds and different apertures. So for any given scene, there's actually a huge range of values you could choose, a whole bunch of different aperture shutter speed pairs that will all end up with correct exposure and the photo will look fine, but you get to choose whether you want long shutter speeds or fast shutter speeds or big aperture holes, small aperture holes, to get the creative effect you want. Like if you wanted a really fast shutter speed to freeze an eagle coming past, well, you can just tell the camera, hey, I want 1,000th of a second for the shutter speed. And the camera will work out and go, gee, I've got to get all that light in 1,000th of a second. I'm going to have to open up that aperture hole really big, and it'll work out the size of the hole and set that for you. Or maybe you're interested in a long, slow shutter speed, like of a waterfall. You want to see all that flowing movement. So you could just tell the camera, hey, I want a 1-second photo. And the camera will then work out that it's going to have to let the light come in slowly through a little hole, and it'll set the size of the hole for you. Or maybe you're not interested in shutter speed at all. You want a particular aperture. We'll learn in another lecture about how the actual aperture links into what's going on with your depth of field. But for now, let's just say you wanted, this much aperture. So if you tell the camera to make the aperture hole that big, it'll then work out the shutter speed has to be this long to go with it. You don't need to try and balance these two things yourself unless you're in manual mode or something, and there's almost no call for that. Unless you're in a studio or a few other things, there's a bit of a misnomer around that, to be a real photographer you need to use manual mode. Just completely not true. So how do we actually start to shift this balance? How do we unlock some of that creative potential from the camera? Well, yep, that's when you've got to step out of auto mode.